Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we are so glad to have you. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. What's going on, Josh?
Hey, Will, good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be seen. And today we have joining with us Holly Berkley Fletcher, who is a historian and essayist who grew up in Kenya as a missionary kid. She earned her PhD in American history, later spent nearly 2 decades as an Africa analyst at the CIA. And her new book, The Missionary Kids, draws on her personal story and deep research to unpack what MKs, missionary kids, reveal about evangelicalism. So welcome to the show, Holly.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, you are the third CIA person
Oh,
we
really?
have had on our show.
Who
Yeah.
else have you had?
We've had Abigail Spanberger
Oh, wow. Wow.
and Paul Miller. I think he was CIA. He wrote a book about Christian nationalism.
Oh, was he CIA? I didn't know he was CIA. Maybe
Maybe,
briefly.
maybe under, I know he was under Bush and Obama, and he worked in the intelligence, and I don't know, yeah, one of those letters. Oh, you know what? And another guy, we had a professor. Oh gosh, dang it! If I had a memory, Bob something. He's a professor up DC somewhere, and he was the general counsel for Michael Hayden.
Oh,
Wasn't it Weiss or Weiss or something? Weiss? Bob Weiss? Something like that.
once.
It might have been, but funny guy, hilarious. like,
I don't know him, but I know, well, I don't, he wouldn't know me, but I know General Hayden, who's just the most wonderful person. I mean, he's fantastic. So,
that's awesome. Well, you wrote a book called "The Missionary Kids" with a subtitle that I don't have on my notes right now, but it deals with white evangelicalism. So,
right.
tell us what the book is called, complete with subtitles, and why did you write the book?
The subtitle is Unmasking the Myths of White Evangelicalism. And I wrote the book because just from starting grappling with my own story, um, and then talking to my cohorts over the years, I decided I wanted to, yeah, sort of present, not, you can't capture, you can't tell a missionary kid story, but try to draw out some of the themes in our experiences and what it says about this culture that frankly worships our parents. And to present a lot of the history of the American missionary movement, and connect kind of what we grew up with. And I interviewed people of all ages, so people much older than me. I'm sort of the midpoint, and then people much younger than me, and how that connects with past experiences. And yeah, just operating on the premise that missions has been so central to white evangelical identity from the beginning. We certainly grew up with an idea that our parents were super important to this religious culture, and to try to get behind a lot of the sort of mythology that's been built up around missions. That is, frankly, a lot of it is, creating us a narrative that reflects a positive image of white evangelicals back to themselves. So that's, I thought that was an important message at this time when I think, I think the white evangelical narrative about themselves has fed into some of the problems that we're seeing now.
Number one, I didn't realize MK is an acronym for missionary kids. So I mean, I learned a lot from your book, but like that was just sort of like a one little data point because I'm married to a PK, and before I married
Yeah.
a PK, I didn't know what a PK was. like when because I wasn't a Christian when I met my wife. So I'm curious though just about mission life because number one, like for listeners that may not even know what the heck a mission is or a missionary, I mean I think people probably understand what a missionary is, but like why do people go to other countries kind of on the premise that they are going to help some sort of disadvantaged community? Like what is it about sort of Christians that makes them think that that's something we should be doing?
Yeah, so I go back in the history too, because the American missionary movement is really the sort of dominant one within modern Christianity and actually of Protestantism, where there wasn't a sizable Protestant missions movement until the Anglo-American movement coming out of the Great Awakening started in the very, very late, but really more into the 19th century. And, and in my book, even though I've kind of gone on a theological journey myself, I take evangelicals at their word and at their sort of core belief that they believe that people that don't accept Jesus, and not just any Christianity, but their sort of version of Christianity, that people who don't accept that brand of Christianity and that version of Jesus are literally going to hell. And so they are trying to get out there and save as many souls as they can. And it's sometimes mingled with more or less with sort of humanitarian aid. That's certainly an element of it. But for evangelicals, it's really about winning converts. And the humanitarian impulse is sort of a conduit for that versus the main, sort of the main event. Although evangelical groups do a lot of great humanitarian work. So.
Yeah, I grew up in church. I'm a pastor. My dad's a pastor. I grew up in Assemblies of God, which is an evangelical Pentecostal.
Oh, they're big in missions. A lot of
huge. Yeah. My aunt was a missionary in the Assemblies of God. So my cousins grew up as missionary kids as well. And I knew many missionaries. The Assemblies has a really well-established missions program and training and all this stuff, and even missiology departments and all that in there. In some of their seminaries, I believe, at least courses and teachers. And so, I understand the kind of impetus behind evangelicals wanting to bring this gospel. And I would love to get a deeper view, because I essentially grew up thinking missionaries were, basically heroes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a major point of the book.
That was a really big, they were heroes. They're worth investment, especially. And there's an enormous amount of investment that has been given. And I would just love to hear, what is it about Missionary Kids stories and the way that you're bringing it out in your book? Why does this reveal? Why is it a revealing lens into white America? And why is it a revealing? Just tell us why. That was the second part of the question, and it's kind of escaping me. So
yeah, no, I think Missionary Kids, I think the insider outsider perspective is often a really valuable one, whatever endeavor you're looking at. So they're deep inside. That's part of their sort of day-to-day lives, but they're not the ones that have personally invested in it. They haven't chosen to be there. And then they're often the victims of its I don't know if excesses is the right word, but it's failings. They're often the ones that bear the burden of its failings. So they have a very different perspective than their parents. And then in a broader sense too, they have an insider outsider perspective on America and the American church, because again, we are raised, by American families, and certainly in a white American little evangelical bubble in whatever country that we grow up in. But we're very much raised in that world. But at the same time, we aren't, we become emotionally attached to a different country and sometimes different friends, and that becomes part of something that we carry with us too. And often I don't fully identify with being an American, or certainly don't have the emotional attachment to that. So this sort of being in between worlds, I think, is a valuable perspective, where we know we know what we're critiquing, but we can see it in a different light than maybe people that are fully in it can do.
Yeah, I really love that because in a former life, I used to travel quite a bit. And whenever I would travel abroad, I would never feel as much. I would never feel as much like an American as I would when I go to a different country. It's like the weirdest thing because you get there and going to another country as a black person as well. Like sometimes I'm like, should I just not say anything so people don't know that I'm not American? Like
They
and
probably tell anyway, just by the way you're dressed or what have you.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, yeah. Not a lot of black people I know wear shirts that say "Let's talk about Jesus." So you're
Well,
right.
in Kenya they might, because that's kind of one of the fallacies. All these evangelicals still like beat a path to sub-Saharan Africa, when sub-Saharan Africa is way, way more not just Christian but evangelical Christian than the United States at this point. But they're still like, that's where you go for the mission trips. So
Yeah,
there's some racial assumptions in there, I think.
I want to read an excerpt from your book that really kind of caught me, and it's in regards to John Piper and his comment about kids. So, in your book, you write, Piper goes on to claim that there are worse risks for our children than death. This is simple Bible reality, not easy, just simple. It is not complex or hard to grasp. There are things vastly worse than death. Wasting your life is worse than losing it. He goes on, life not given to great things is not worth living. Risk your life and the life of your children to be part of greatness. So my question is, what?
Yeah, that quote is actually deeply wounding for me to read. And when I came across it, it kind of took my breath away, because it really sort of confirmed. And I realized John Piper is not, the Pope of evangelicalism or the spokesperson, but what it does is it articulates, it kind of tells the truth about what we all feel very much implicitly, which is that there's something more important than us, as children. Like you're sort of secondary to this, this calling, this faith, this religion, this sort of dogma. Like you're less important than that. And then in many cases we are sent to boarding school. Certainly in the past that was more common. And so then that just adds, another layer of feeling, abandoned, not important, deprioritized. So that quote is really, and then not myself, but I interviewed people who literally were put in danger, and suffered abuse, and suffered real consequences of their parents' frankly foolish and arrogant sense of calling and pursuit of greatness. I think that word's really telling. Is it really about the work of God, or is it about your own sense of greatness? And I think that quote is very telling on a number of levels. But these children that were put through that, they suffered the after effects of that their whole entire lives. And it has a deep, deep effect on people's lives. And I personally don't believe that God calls us. I think if you choose to become a parent, that automatically becomes your main calling, is to shape and love new human beings and prepare them for a life of love and nurturing of other human beings after that. Because generational trauma is, that's not something you want to mess with. That can be really damaging, not just to your children, but then future many other people in the world. It reverberates beyond what we can know. So I believe if that's your, I tell people, I'm like, Jesus and Paul, neither one of them they both understood that ministry and family don't always go together. And they both had a sense of calling and did not have families. But if you have a family, then that has to be a factor in your sense of calling.
Yeah, it's interesting because that sense of calling has almost this like sacred aura behind it, right? And this is one of the things that you bring out, and you call it the myth of calling. Now, this is really interesting to me because so much of my life has been driven by a sense of call, including in coming and planting this church, starting this podcast, planting this church. I planted a church in Richmond, and then starting this podcast, and even going into ministry, things like that. All of
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
was part of this sense of deep calling
Yeah,
that I had. And you can't put calling in like a laboratory, right? To experiment it and to say, hey, did this really come from God, right? Or if I put this chemical in, it changes color to this, and I know my
right,
calling
right. Yeah,
is thus here. It doesn't work like that. It's always this mixture of intuition, spirituality. And of
absolutely.
course, a lot of it depends on your assumptions about calling in general, if it's even possible, if God would even do that kind of thing, if there's even a God. And I know all that to say, like, it can get kind of complicated. How did you, like, what was your, like, how did you approach this in terms of like the method that you're using to try to figure out like calling, like, how do we determine, or even like, maybe that's not even something that you were thinking about, and more of like this effect of this idea on all these different kids. I guess I would love for you to unpack this myth of calling
Yeah.
more,
Yeah,
really.
I think if
Yeah, go
people
ahead.
don't read the book and they just see that, they think that I'm saying that there's no such thing as calling, which is totally not what I believe.
Sure, sure.
I've certainly felt a sense of calling in my own life, even in writing this book, actually, just the way things came together and the opportunities that, just I just definitely felt called to write this book. Now, people who don't agree with the book may question my sense of calling, right? But that's kind of that's the whole thing, right?
Right.
You can't prove it one way or the other. So I guess what I'm not a theologian. I'm very clear about that. So I would not
Sure.
I would not sort of get into the theology of calling. And I think even people who are of a secular mindset, have a similar sense of there's, what is, wanting to feel like, they may use different terms, but there's a sense of calling that a lot of us have. Or I think I talk about the book, how living in a society where there's so much choice, we have so much freedom and choice compared to many other societies, most other societies actually, that I think a sense of sort of destiny or calling, or like some sort of divinely ordained path, that finding that it's a comforting thing for us, like it's something that, like, oh, now I know, of all these paths that I could take, like I found the right one, and that feels, that makes me feel sort of comforted in the midst of all of these decisions that we have to make in our life. So I think calling is a real thing that people certainly gravitate to. I guess the myth of calling is that, again, like, you can, whatever sense that you have, that it's always good, that it's never can be questioned, that everything else has to be subsumed underneath that. And that's usually what you find in evangelical culture is, again, if someone claims a calling, it's like, oh, that's it. Like, you back off. You can't question that. And I think it's really, I mean, by unscrupulous individuals, it's really abused. I have a relative who ended up in an abusive
Agreed.
marriage because a man, claimed that God was telling him that she was to be his wife. Well, he was an abuser, and she ended up in an abusive situation because of his sense of calling. So, and then the other thing I see on where this goes awry on the mission field is, there's this idea that, oh, if you have a calling, it's always healthy. And it's like, no, if you're not a healthy person, your sense of calling can actually come from a really wounded place, a place that really you need help. You don't need to go be a hero somewhere. You need to be, you don't need to minister to others. You need to be ministered to, before you can be equipped. Maybe that is a real calling, but it's also, can function as an escape. And in the book, I talk about this actually on a sort of national grand cultural level of how the missionary endeavor writ large really became an escape for the white church in America. And they could sort of, at the same time that white evangelicals were, so, at the beginning holding slaves, but then afterwards, sometimes participating, if not just doing nothing about terrible racial violence and oppression. At the same time that they're sending missionaries to Africa and other places, and it became an escape from, and a way of sort of writing their own narrative of race, in which they weren't the bad guys. So I think nation's sense of calling can come from an unhealthy place, can be escapist, can be a deflection and a projection. There's a lot of unhealthy things that can get packed up in that notion of calling. So the myth of calling is not that there is no such thing as calling. It's just that, it's not automatically something you can't question, something that's automatically good, and from a good place.
I'm curious if people that go on mission trips that are Christian, like, is there ever any like training on stuff like manifest destiny, like history stuff?
That's a
Like,
good question. Yeah.
like, because I'd imagine Christians going into a country, especially if no other missionaries have been there before, and that country happens to know a thing or two about the manifest destiny, and Christians coming, like I'd be asking for papers. Like, did the Queen tell you, like tell me why you're in my country, So I'm just curious because I don't understand how or why. Like, number one, Africa is like the chosen
Oh, yeah.
place. So maybe you.
Cynical.
Yeah, yeah. Can you just unpack that, like the manifest destiny thing, and then why
Yeah,
Africa?
absolutely. Yeah, so it's interesting that you say you wonder if there's training about that. So since since the civil rights movement and sort of the more enlightened period of white American Christianity, where they've sort of there's been some level of repentance from the racial past, although I would argue it's pretty shallow. There's definitely been more sort of multiculturalism brought into missionary training, where you sort of, there's conversations about, in the past, missionaries came and they demanded all sorts of cultural, conversions in addition to any sort of religious conversion. And there's an awareness of like, well, that's not necessarily the case. Like there's a lot of cultural things that can be that are congruous with small o Orthodox Christian belief, and that those to sort of make allowance for that. So there's a lot more sort of multiculturalism, but I think actually, and you asking me this it really dawns on me that I don't think there is any real integration of missions with the history of missions. And I think that's actually a really important point, because if you look at the full history of missions, there's no question, not only that it was tied up with a sense of nationalism and Christian nationalism that goes back, some of the early missionaries were the Crusaders, who literally went like, convert or die, But in the American movement, it was tied up with a sense of American exceptionalism and, yes, manifest destiny, and sort of, converting non-white, heathen, lesser people, not only to Christianity, but to various ways of life. I think in the more modern era, where there is more multiculturalism, there's still a sense that white American evangelical Christianity is the correct one, and the sense that so again, sending missionaries into other countries where they have long Christian traditions, that's of no matter. They're just considered heathen from the get-go, and you want to convert them to your Christianity. And there's also it's sort of a continued hoarding of power, money, and control in American missions, even while there's more and more global Christians who are going as missionaries or who want to go as missionaries. So I think the number of American missionaries, America is still the number one missionary sending country, but by the numbers, over half of the missionaries around the world are not American at this point. But the American movement continues to dominate the money and hold the purse strings and dominate the missiology and the theology and the all of those things. There's still a lot of control that's exercised there. So yeah, and then there's just a kind of lack of awareness, I think, on the part of white evangelicals of how the missionary movement has functioned, not necessarily overseas, but here in America, and how it has functioned as, again, a bit of an escapist element, self-glorification technique, or sort of strategy I just see it's just when you look at the racial history of America and you look at the development of the missionary movement, the parallel sort of tracks are just so striking. They're investing all of this time and money and energy in going overseas at the same time that they're just really digging in on and doing nothing to address race relations here in the United States.
And the Africa thing, you alluded
Oh
that
yeah,
it's
yeah.
political.
No, so I just think, again, I think it's very, very much tied up with the with our sense of race and our racial history here in America. The idea that, Africans racially are the most different than we, white American Christians. And so therefore they must also be, the most heathen and at one time maybe there were very few African Christians, but at this point the amount of attention that Africa continues to get in the missionary movement is really absurd, because there is sub-Saharan Africa. When I go and I travel a lot on the continent, it is just like gobsmacking how evangelical, from the names of the buses to the politicians to the the t-shirts people wear to just how people talk in their everyday lives. There are, it is a very evangelical place, and it's kind of bizarre to see Americans still idolizing Africa as the ultimate mission field. So,
Wait, so are you saying that, like, in Africa, like, it looks like little America? Like, do they have like?
yeah. So I think it's it's hard to parse out influence. I that's a difficult thing to measure, but I certainly see African Christian, and I've had other African theologians tell me this, that African Christianity, African theology, African churches, they're all sort of little disciples of white evangelicals. It's been going so long that now it's even a kind of a boomerang effect, to when they're sending, the missionaries they're sending to America are sometimes, they're more white evangelical than even American, Christians. So it's really funny, but the theology is very much influenced by American theology. It's not just the missionaries, but since the 1970s in particular, it's all of the, the publications and the media, the mass media. And now, of course, it's, YouTube videos and influencers and so on and so forth. So American culture is, ubiquitous generally around the world. American movies and books and thought and, and just culturally, America looms so large. And that's definitely true in global, certainly in global evangelicalism. I think it's a little bit like, I think the Catholic Church is truly a global church. But in evangelicalism is, in its beginnings, was an Anglo-American movement, and it's still very much an American influence movement, even as it spreads all over the world.
Yeah, and I think something you said before really helps, or alluded to before really helps, I think, explain this. The money is in America, right? So much of the money is in America.
We're so rich.
Europe isn't sending very many missionaries in terms of, I don't think, right, from Europe to other places.
Yeah. Actually, it always cracks me up, because I grew up, sorry if I can just interject quickly, don't lose your point, but like I grew up with some European missionary kids, evangelical missionaries who would leave Europe, which is so secular, as you know, and they would come to sub-Saharan Africa as missionaries, and it just always made me laugh, because it's like,
it is mind blowing. I totally understand. It's funny because it's like missions trips. We would go on missions trips, and we basically go there, and I have some funny stories from these trips, but essentially it was going and hanging out with a bunch of teenagers, getting ourselves into like potentially precarious situations, Not really, but I mean, sometimes, yeah, I was walking with a group of kids and freaking like in the back, like these back streets of Panama and like Panama City. And like we were supposed to be inviting people to this, rally, and nobody ended up coming. And then there was a dog that literally killed a chicken right in front of us as we were
That's
like,
a
I'm
great
not even
missionary
kidding.
story.
Yeah, dude, we were trying to, and there's nobody in the audience except like some family that just showed up there that had no idea what we were doing. And you see these stories, and all this money is spent, and really, it was like this logic started to shift. It was like this sense of like, well, we're not really helping them, but it's really helping us.
It's
It's
an
really
education.
helping,
Yeah.
yeah, the spirituality of the students. And so the justification kind of shifts as you're going, and it becomes this massive, like, incentivized system for who's going to get, who's going to be best at fundraising, who's going to be able to get, you have to have the best mission trips so you can have people sponsor you and fundraise for you. So you need to be able to put on churches and bring them out and all this stuff. I can see, and I know some of it, not the inner workings of it. But I know enough of it to see those trends and to see that happen. And I wanted to point out just a couple of the pieces of evidence that you were bringing that I thought were absolutely like mind blowing to me. For instance, that 53% of your survey, if this is correct me if I'm wrong, purported trauma, 80% saying there's higher living standards than the locals, which I'm not really surprised about necessarily. And so maybe you can go into that, like, was there a negative aspect of that connected with that?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would love for you to kind of go into that. Like, this is surprising, especially trauma. Like, what's going on behind this with the missionary kids? And what were they saying?
Well, some of it's linked. When you go, those 2 points are somewhat linked. So when you go as a missionary, as an American, usually white, most American missionaries are white. I think only 1% is certainly black, and then there's more partnerships with Korean and Brazilian missionaries than Americans. So there's some of those, on the mission field. But the overwhelming number of American missionaries are white. So you're going as a white sort of American and into a culture. There are missionaries that go to Europe, but mostly you're going to places that are non-white and very poor. Okay, so you stand out like a sore thumb, and you basically have a massive dollar sign on you. So you become, you become a target. If there's insecurity and poor rule of law, you can be a target. Your security can be, an issue. And so what happens a lot of times is so you're basically, it's hard for you to really integrate as a peer into the community. So for racial, socio, all of those things are tied together. And so you sort of end up creating, whether you want to or not, you live in kind of a bubble, where you're not really part of the community. And then even with the bubble, you're often, again, stick out like a sore thumb. And in some places, that becomes a security issue. So the two are kind of linked, the massive economic disparity and then the trauma, because a lot of the trauma that is experienced is, run-ins with crime, terrorism, war, living in places that are very insecure. So those two things are kind of linked. Yeah.
Well, we haven't really got into it much, but I'd love to hear, like, what was your missionary experience like? And, talk to us about what it was like living in the places you've lived, how long you've done it. I think you mentioned in the book something about your family moved, like, all your stuff to include, like, a beige couch or
Yeah, my
sofa.
family was weird. So yeah, my dad had a full 21 career in the army. And they had children late in life compared to other people of their generation. So they were by the time he retired and they became missionaries, I was only 8 years old. I was 7 years old when he retired. So I was 7, my sister was 10. So he had a full career and yet still pretty young children. Well, so therefore his missionary career was basically a second career. And so, unlike most missionaries, they had, first of all, a good financial cushion in the fact that he had a pension, a military pension. They were also Southern Baptist missionaries, which are more financially secure compared to everyone else, because the Southern Baptists, their missionary organization is basically a huge corporation and pays their people, salaries and benefits and all that. And most missionaries don't live like that. So, and then the other thing is they were, when you retire from the military, the government, U.S. government, will give you one last move to wherever you want to go. And there's no limit on, how much stuff and where. And they said, can we literally move anywhere? And they're like, yeah, you can literally move. And so they tell the army that, well, we're moving to Kenya. And so, very foolish of them, frankly. I can say this. I don't know if they would say this, but they literally brought every last thing we owned to Kenya, other than my dad had some weaponry from his career that was not legal. So that was, stay behind. And things like my mother's wedding dress and some keepsake items. They had like one cedar chest in my grandparents' house, the things that they left behind. But other than that, they literally took every last thing that they had. So here we were in small town, Kenya. And the house we lived in was not necessarily that nice. It had some serious structural problems, for one thing. So it wasn't like the house itself wasn't that nice.
Wait,
But
how old were you?
I was 8 when we arrived. Yeah. But it was filled with just all kinds of like fancy crap. Like my mother had a china cabinet with silver and china. And like, our housework would like polish the silver, and like, it was just crazy. And like, we had rugs and bookshelves and tons of books. And, most families had a severe limit on how much you could bring and just brought the bare basics, and their houses tended to be kind of spare and basic. And so even missionaries would come into our house and be like, what is this? And as a child, I was actually mortified by it. I had a very strong sense as a child, of the inequality. And it really bothered me. Sometimes I would feel kind of puffed up about it because you're a stupid kid, but mostly I felt just mortified and horrified, and just like, it really bothered me. That has stayed with me my whole life, is this I just grieve for inequality, like, if socialism worked, which it does not, I would be a socialist, because I just would love everyone to be the same, and to just have the same things. And I just hated feeling so high above everyone. But other than things like that, my childhood was pretty happy. The main trauma was I went to boarding school young. I was 10. And that was definitely traumatic, the first year or so, and that has definitely had a lasting impact on me and my family relationships, for sure. But overall, I love Kenya. I have a deep emotional attachment to Kenya. I go back quite a lot, and worked on Africa at the Central Intelligence Agency. So that love, I wouldn't trade it for anything, even though it's, love and grief are two sides of a coin, and the grief of not really belonging. And I call it an unrequited love. And that's kind of the best way I can describe that. And I still carry that with me as well, the grief and the love.
That's really beautiful. I appreciate you saying that. And I have had connections again with other missionary kids, and have heard similar things. And I just appreciate that. I would love to think about the idea of the myth of the saints for a little bit. This idea where there's this aura of sainthood almost around missionaries, and almost making them invulnerable to critique potentially. What is the myth of saints, and how has this been fleshed out how do you deal with it in the book?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that section of the book was pretty tough because I was aware of some abuse at some pretty serious situations, not involving me personally, but that I witnessed in the missionary community where I knew, I had a very clear sense that they weren't saints, we had a murderer in our community that I talk about in the book. So I was aware of that, but I was not directly abused. But then in doing the research of the book, I realized how I heard many stories and I realized how prevalent it is. So there's a lot of things that go into the reason why abuse can be prevalent on the mission field. First of all, in evangelicalism in particular, I think white evangelicalism, and you see this domestically as well with the different sex abuse crises. When you have this, when at the core of your identity and your spiritual identity is this sense of rightness, that you're the one, it's your theology that's correct, everybody else is wrong, like your beliefs are certain, there's no room for doubt, there's no room for, you're the ones that have everything right. It doesn't exactly create a great climate for accountability and self-reflection, right? So when something bad happens in these cultures and environments, the instinct is, sweep it under the rug because letting it out will tarnish both our image of ourselves, but also the image we project to the outside world. It's us versus them, and like we have to sort of circle the wagons. So there's that element of things on the mission field as well. But I think it's sort of elevated because missionaries are elevated in evangelical culture. They're seen as sort of the cream of the crop. But then compounding that is just the structural realities of overseas existence, the fact that missionaries, there's a lot of legal sort of no man's land. Before 2003, there was no, if someone committed abuse overseas and then, if they weren't prosecuted in country, and it's hard enough to prosecute such crimes in the United States, in countries where there's poor rule of law and where there's a lot of privilege with being a foreigner and where even child abuse is not a well articulated idea. Women's rights are not what they are in the United States. So if they weren't prosecuted in the country where they're living, there was no way for the American law to reach them either, and so they usually slip through the cracks. 2003, a law was passed giving federal jurisdiction over Americans who commit child abuse overseas. And that has been really important. I think that's probably the main reason why a lot of mission boards and missionary boarding schools for the first time implemented and devised sort of child protection strategies. I don't think it was out of the goodness of their heart. I think it was because they knew the law was coming for them. And subsequent laws removed the statute of limitations for civil suits, which was another thing that protected a lot of these boards. So that's been really important, but it's still very hard, forensically, just the logistics. It's like I said, it's hard enough to prosecute sex crimes in particular here in the United States. And when you add the distance and all of the different hurdles that an international jurisdiction involves, then it becomes even that much harder. So there are some structural problems on the mission field, and human beings, I don't care who they are, human beings are going to human, and without accountability, abuse can thrive in any culture where there's no accountability. I don't care how religious and in fact, I think religion sometimes often makes it worse because again, it creates this false sense of righteousness, that a sense of like this doesn't happen with us, and that's just not true.
Is there like a diplomatic angle to missions work, and if so, like how does that work? I guess exists in this environment where USAID is like no longer a PEPFAR, it's no longer like a viable thing for the world.
Yeah. So there's not really in the past, in the far further distant past 50s or so, there was more interface between U.S. government and missionaries, including CIA, actually. But in the recent years, the U.S. government, certainly CIA, has pretty much prohibited contact with missionaries for their own sort of safety. And there's not much of a connection between the diplomatic community and the missionary community. It's a pretty there's not much interaction at all, except when, like there's a security issue. Obviously, the embassy is aware of what Americans are in the country, and a lot of times those are missionaries. And so there might be some interface on security matters and stuff like that. But on policy, no. I will say USAID, missionary organizations, did get a lot of USAID contracts over the years. Anybody in any NGO can apply for, or could, back when USAID existed, could apply for contracts where you would, you have to submit a lot of paperwork, and there's a lot of accountability involved, but you could submit sort of a plan of action and get sort of USAID funding. So there was that sort of connectivity. And then, in different realms, particularly with USAID, there might be more interaction and interface. But generally, the missionary community and the U.S. government community doesn't sort of get involved. Except, I will say, and this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, missionaries, like what happened, it happened again a couple weeks ago. Missionaries who go into or live in very insecure areas that they shouldn't be in, frankly. And they think they're being sort of heroes / martyrs. But what happens is when
Like Florida.
when they get kidnapped, as one was a couple weeks ago, it is, it's so irresponsible. The whole U.S. government is then bound to basically make them the number one priority, and it becomes it can endanger lives of American military personnel. It certainly takes up a lot of funds. So when people see these, I get from the U.S. government perspective, because I worked and I saw these cases from the inside. And I see American churches sort of celebrating, oh, so-and-so, kidnapped by jihadists. What a hero, what a hero. And I just think, what an idiot, please. Like, I always say, God speaks through the State Department travel warnings. Listen to the State Department travel warnings. So.
That's funny. I love that.
I'm kind of cold-hearted.
You just gave me my sermon for this weekend. God speaks to the State Department travel warnings. Dude, that'll preach no matter where you are. I want to kind of focus in on the challenge you make to American missionaries not being the central character in global evangelicalism. We've talked about this, but of course I grew up thinking, oh, yes, it's American missionaries. I also grew up hearing, other countries are sending missionaries to America now. This is why, essentially, we need to make America Christian again. And so it's this is kind of like all this stuff is being said, right? There's missionaries coming from other countries. They're doing what only we are supposed to do, or maybe that's the critique or the caricature of that kind of understanding that we would critique. And I guess I want to slightly push back on it and ask the question, when you're looking at this, is this like, and maybe it's just a clarification, is this systematic of the entire system, the things that you're bringing out, or is it more like these are human organizations that are, and it's an issue like they've failed to keep accountability. They lost, the balance of powers within an organization or whatever it was, and things got overseen. Because there's I'm sure many positive cases of things that have happened, people have done, right? And I'm not saying I'm not saying you aren't saying that. I think you acknowledge that. But I'm just wondering, for someone who's listening to this and like, maybe they're skeptical, maybe they're like, oh, I don't know. I mean, you think about all the good that was done. Think about all, this and maybe, hey, if someone wants to go die for their faith, go ahead and die. Now, of course, you're saying they're taking their children
Yeah.
and they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
And so that's where the morally questionable part comes in.
And
Anyway,
then when they
talk
expect
about
the
that. Yeah,
government to come and save them. So
yes, that's true. They're going to be a martyr for Jesus, and when they get caught, oh
my
hey, can you come get me, guys? I'm
yeah,
an American
my
citizen.
view is I think the US government frankly should issue the warnings and basically designate some countries as like you on your own. Like we're not coming after you. But anyway, we don't do that as Americans. So there's that.
Yet.
Anyway, that's kind of my little pet peeve. I'll leave that to the side. Yeah, so I think obviously all human endeavors are human and therefore there's fallibility. I think when things become systemic is when things are routinely not there's routinely not appropriate accountability, and then that becomes a systemic thing. And then you see, and I certainly saw this when it's not just the one bad person doing it, but then it becomes an organizational cover up, where they are ushered home and allowed to continue on with no repercussions. There's a lot of people that were involved in cases that I've been privy to in that becomes systemic. The other thing I would say, and I think this is clear in the book, but just to make it clear, is I'm less concerned, certainly on the ground in these countries where missions is taking place, there can be harm, there can be good, a lot of it's probably just a benign or sort of neutral at this point. I think in history there's certainly been some cases, but even historically, I think sometimes the sort of left version of the missionary as sort of colonial power or whatever, and all the harm of cultural annihilation. Often that's also overblown. So I kind of leave that to the side because I think it's a mixed bag. What I'm concerned with is how the missionary endeavor has inflated American Christians' sense of self and kept them from really, learning and growing from this experience, because I do think that there are opportunities to learn and grow. Certainly for the missionaries themselves, that's been the case in many instances, although not always the case. But they're not really given, the incentive structure isn't there for them to then be teachers and prophets for the church based on what the wider aperture that they've maybe acquired, because they have to raise funds from the same people who just want to hear their cool stories in which they're the heroes. I think American Christians in missions and in many other endeavors center themselves to a great degree. And I think that creates just a real myopia that is damaging on every level. On a spiritual level, I think on a national level here in America, it's been a big part of the arrogance in our own culture and how we deal with our history and in our current politics. And so I would just, love it if American Christians would decenter themselves. Like, it's not all about you. Actually, America was not founded until 1776 as a country. What do people think God was doing for 1700 years? Since the Jesus time? Like, what do you think Jesus was doing? Just sitting around waiting for America to be born? And if America, goes by the wayside, Jesus has his own agenda. Like, that may or may not involve us. And Jesus is doing things all over the world at all times, and it doesn't need to involve you, and it doesn't involve you in many cases. And so I just I would just love to see American Christians realize that it's not all about them.
Geez, yeah, that should be your message, Josh, this weekend. My last question for you, Holly. So if a family came to you that you're close with, said, "Hey, Holly, I got this itch. I want to go, do what God's calling me to do. He's telling me I need to, go to another country, do missions work, me and my family. Like, what would you tell them? Would you discourage them, encourage them, have them sort of think deeper about why they're going? And then, so the follow-up question is, would your advice change if the country is another country, like not Africa, or, continent, I should say? So like if, would your advice change depending on the country that they want to go to?
It's a country. I think if they have children, they first of all need to think about the well-being of the children. Maybe God is calling them to go somewhere, but maybe not when they have their children. Their children can be grown and they can go later. I mean, it depends on a lot of things. What are their children's particular needs? A lot of countries, like if you have children with special needs, there's no care for them, and there's no what kind of schooling is your children? What kind of socialization? Who will your children have? The safety. There's a lot of questions just on that that they would need to think about. But more broadly, I think that I think people act out their wounds through missions a lot of times. So I would want them to go to therapy first, and get through whatever trauma they may be acting out of. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. And then I would just want them to read about history and see what the history of this movement is, and how, if they do go, how can they break cycles? How can they decenter themselves in the endeavor? How can they make, are you going to be the heroes in this story, or who are the heroes of the story going to be? That's a big question. In whatever it is you're doing, like, who are the heroes who are you going to make the heroes of the story? Is it you? Or is it maybe, and also, like, what is the ultimate goal, and can it be accomplished another way? Because I think that a lot of American Christians are more invested in what they get to do than what is being done and how it's being done. So all these mission trips, for instance, I mean, let's just be honest. And I'm not opposed to mission trips if we're honest about what the purpose is, which the purpose is for you to have a spiritual experience. Basically, you're looking for some sort of actualization, spiritual experience, maybe some education. But again, most of the people that go on these mission trips go without ever even picking up a book about the country, without ever cracking, not even reading a whole book, without even cracking. They have no idea the politics, but they know nothing about the country. So they've literally learned nothing. They really don't have any interest in learning. And so, so the main reason is for them to have an experience. Okay, fine. But don't then create this narrative in which you're somehow a hero, and all the money spent on short-term missions. Like, if the point is to build a church, just send the money and have the local community send the money to the church and let them hire people who need money for like a fraction of the cost. So there's just a lot of inefficiencies in the missionary movement that, to me, I come away with thinking that the overall point is it's some sort of American hero fantasy camp in many cases. And if that's the case, like, just be honest. Like, I'm going to be a Christian hero, and that's an experience I want to have. Just be honest about it.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. You heard it here, folks. I love it. I'm definitely challenged by this conversation. I'm sympathetic to a lot of the stuff you're saying, because I've experienced it. I've seen it. I know what drives people to want to be able to do this, want to be able to go on these trips, want to be able to feel like you're doing something, making a difference, all this stuff, and you want to be able to go do it. Yeah, of course.
Secular people love it too, by the way.
Yeah, it's not a justification. Yes, it is. It's not a justification for the kinds of inefficiencies and abuse and things like that, obviously, that you've been pointing out in some of your research and writing. And I just appreciate your work. Thanks for doing this. Is there a preferred vendor that you have for the book? And how can people connect with you and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, no, wherever books are sold, if you can support a local bookstore, I think that's great. I'm a big fan of local bookstores or bookshop. I think it's called bookshop.org is a
It
online
is.
distributor that works with local bookstores. But really anywhere, audio, it's on, ebook, Kindle, your library, a lot of libraries have it, or you can ask your library to get it. And then I have a Substack called A Zebra Without Stripes that you can check out as well.
Well, thank you so much again for coming on here. Really appreciate you spending some time with
Thank
us,
you.
Holly.
Thank
It's
you for
been
the
a
work you
great
guys are
conversation.
doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you for tuning in. And to our viewers and listeners, guys, thanks for tuning into this. Make sure that you are liking, subscribing, doing all that stuff that gets this engine continuing to roll as we're growing and trying to get great content out to you guys. Make sure, again, that you're sharing this with someone who needs it. Check out the notes in the description. And until next time, guys, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time.